Welcome all. And before we go to listen to the voices from Chad, I wonder, Abdeassoul, if you could tell us a little bit more about Radio Voix du Ouaddai. You know, how long have you been around? Who is listening to you? How many people are listening to you?
Merci beaucoup. Je n'aurais manqué rien au monde en assistant à cette...
So first of all, I would like to thank Alna for organizing this meeting. And this has been a great experience for me because I was able to meet a lot of people who came from different parts of the world and who had different kind of experience. So concerning the radio station La Voix du Ouaddai, it was created in 2006 by Internews, and the main objective is to provide humanitarian information. And Internews is an organization working on the development of local media and the local media. So in Chad, what we are doing is to provide information for the refugee and also for the local population. So the information for the refugees, we provide news and also about the environment. And we also provide information on awareness on questions related to health, on gender-based violence, and also on education. And because the refugees are very stressed when they come in the refugee camps, we also have programs like music or other similar programs. And the main role of the radio station is to provide information.
Alors, nous servons la Voix du Ouaddai avec ces deux autres radios.
In addition to the radio station La Voix du Ouaddai, we also have two other radio stations called Radio Sila and Radio Abdeassoul. And together with these three radio stations, we have over 200,000 listeners in the refugee camps and over 300,000 in the whole of Chad.
Alors, ça fait maintenant plus de 8 ans que la radio existe.
So it's been a while since this radio has existed, and after Internews is no longer with us, we're almost at the end of the whole program.
Et ces radios qui étaient au début des radios humanitaires.
At the creation of the radio station, mainly it has an objective of humanitarian. He had a humanitarian objective, but right now we have shifted to a more communitarian objective. But within that, we also within our mandate, we also collaborate with other humanitarian agencies in order to transfer their information.
Et je note que Radio
Apart from Radio La Voix du Ouaddai, there's also Radio Sila and Radio Abdeassoul who are also present till now.
Thank you very much, Abdeassoul. And we should note as well that we were not confident about using Wi-Fi to do a phone-in program directly here, which was the original idea. Some of you might recognise where that lack of confidence comes from. And so what we're doing instead is this program was made, I think, 2 months ago. C'était il y a 2 mois. 2 months ago. Abdeassoul will be making a companion program on the basis of this meeting, and hopefully will interview some of you, which will then be broadcast back to the listeners in Chad, so that hopefully we can create some form of loop there. So, with no further ado, can we hear the voices of refugees in Chad?
Camp des réfugiés soudanais de Diabal, environ 2 km de la ville de Goz Beida, accueille aujourd'hui plus de 20 000 personnes. À son installation en juin 2004, il ne compte qu'une dizaine de milliers de personnes. Le chiffre a doublé en presque 10 ans, selon le Haut-Commissariat aux réfugiés sous délégation de Goz Beida. Les services de base, tels que la distribution des vivres, la santé, l'éducation ou encore la préservation de l'environnement, sont assurés par des organismes humanitaires internationaux ou nationaux. Des volets importants qui concourent au bien-être des réfugiés et dont l'exécution, à en croire les responsables humanitaires, nécessite une implication des bénéficiaires à tous les niveaux. Très tôt, les réfugiés ont vaincu une expérience enrichissante en ayant l'opportunité de choisir les femmes et les hommes qui les représenteront dans les différents comités installés. Selon certains leaders de la communauté réfugiée, la vie de la population par rapport aux activités des humanitaires est incessamment demandée. La distribution des vivres est un secteur vital. Chaque opération de distribution est organisée avec minutie. Réunion des formations sur la qualité, quantité de denrées à distribuer, vérification des récipients à utiliser pendant l'opération, le groupe de personnes à être servi en première position. Aïsta Ibrahim, la trentaine, l'une des représentantes des femmes, participe à toutes les rencontres organisées dans le camp. Elle reconnaît que le chemin parcouru est grand parce que, selon elle, il faut se battre chaque fois, à chaque rencontre, pour se faire entendre. Aujourd'hui, sa joie est immense quand elle voit des femmes réfugiées employées pour servir les frères et sœurs lors des opérations de distribution.
Les femmes sont impliquées dans toutes les activités du camp. Elles participent à des réunions. Nos suggestions sont prises en compte. Nous nous réjouissons de ce que font les organismes humanitaires.
Bon nombre de femmes comme Aïsta Ibrahim reconnaissent que la vie de la femme au camp est nettement différente de celle vaincue dans leur village d'origine. La femme est impliquée dans toutes les activités du camp. Khalda Mahamat, 20 ans, dirige les activités dans un centre communautaire. Selon elle, bien que des femmes ne soient pas impliquées dans les décisions finales, comme le choix de denrées alimentaires ou la qualité de l'enseignement, la voix des femmes a quand même du poids dans les décisions.
Nos voix comptent. Par exemple, ici au centre communautaire, nous faisons nous-mêmes la liste des matériels, le choix des couleurs du tel ou tel objet, le stock à faire. Nous organisons nous-mêmes les activités. Même si nous n'avons pas le choix sur les variétés de denrées à distribuer lors de l'opération de distribution générale, parce que les humanitaires nous disent que ça ne dépend pas d'eux, nous sommes écoutés. Et c'est très important pour nous filles de participer à des réunions, à appuyer nos leaders, à convaincre les humanitaires de nous faire participer dans la prise de décision.
L'avenir de nos enfants passe par un système éducatif performant, avoue Arbab Mahamat, président d'une association des parents d'élèves. Depuis plus de 5 ans, avec l'appui des responsables des ONG qui interviennent dans le domaine de l'éducation, il multiplie séances de sensibilisation et réunions pour le maintien des enfants et surtout des filles à l'école. Sa vie a changé avec les interventions des humanitaires. Comme beaucoup de parents, il plaide pour une meilleure condition d'études pour les enfants.
Les écoles fonctionnent bien, que des progrès accomplis depuis 2004 pour nos parents. C'est une expérience constructive que nous vivons au camp grâce à l'intervention des humanitaires. C'est ici au camp que la plupart des parents ont essayé d'envoyer les enfants pour la première fois à l'école. Tout n'est jamais parfait. Je me rends compte qu'à un certain moment, il y a un manque de fournitures, les classes sont surchargées. J'ai dit merci aux humanitaires et nous souhaiterons qu'ils en fassent plus. Et nous, parents, nous nous évertions à mener des sensibilisations pour le maintien de nos progénitures à l'école.
Des signes de la mer, Brahma Mahamat montre des tas de trous creusés en dehors du camp. Ce sont des fosses à ordures. Les immondices sont déposés puis incinérés le soir. C'est la communauté qui choisit l'emplacement des fosses et veille à ce que les ordures ne soient mises à côté. L'objectif est de rendre salubre le camp. La préservation de l'environnement prime soutient le jeune homme. Des gestes simples qui invitent à des changements de comportement et Rahama avoue en être fier.
L'hygiène est le pilier d'une bonne santé. Notre camp paraît propre. Des sensibilisations ont été menées. Le résultat est aujourd'hui probant. La salubrité est une affaire de femmes très jeunes, j'entends ces refrains. Aujourd'hui, partout dans le camp, on nous interpelle à une prise de conscience. Une initiative à encourager, d'autant plus que la protection de notre environnement et de nos vies dépend du suré que nous jeunes allons mettre.
Pour certains, les méthodes utilisées par les humanitaires pour engager avec les communautés ont très peu d'impact. Abdelaziz Yaya Adam est enseignant au primaire. Selon lui, les suggestions de la communauté ont peu d'écho auprès des humanitaires. Il soutient fermement que les ONG dictent les lois. Il donne un exemple, la réduction des primes en 2013 qui s'est faite sans aucune consultation.
Sans l'avis de l'association des parents d'élèves, ni celui des enseignants, les primes des enseignants ont été réduites. Avec ou sans prime, nous devons de faire des sacrifices car nous accordons du prix à l'intérêt supérieur de nos enfants. Nous, enseignants et ONG, nous devons s'asseoir et discuter de ce qui marche bien et ce qui ne l'est pas. Ça n'a pas été fait. Voyez maintenant, les conséquences ont été désastreuses. Une sorte de démotivation est ressentie du côté des enseignants. C'est un avis personnel, mais je me dis, enseignants et ONG devront élaborer ensemble le programme, les modules de formation. À l'avenir, nous aimerions être consultés.
Depuis quelques années, des réductions des services sont notées pour le commissariat aux réfugiés. Cette situation s'explique par un manque de fonds d'une part et d'autre part par le fait que les réfugiés s'adonnent à des activités génératrices de revenus qui leur permettent de s'autosuffire. Un avis qui n'est pas partagé par une grande partie de la population du camp. Abdallah Diouma affirme que les besoins des réfugiés demeurent énormes. Selon lui, il est primordial de trouver des solutions à cette situation.
Depuis 2013, il y a des changements, je dirais même des manquements. Beaucoup manquent. Nous avons des personnes à besoins spécifiques. Par rapport à cette catégorie, je suggère que les ONG fassent une étude très approfondie pour cerner les besoins réels de ces personnes âgées et apporter des solutions iguales dans la limite de leurs possibilités. Les membres de la communauté feront de leur mieux pour les assister, mais ici, nous avons tous nos besoins spécifiques. La grande partie de la population s'adonne à des activités comme l'agriculture, surtout pendant la saison pluvieuse. Mais cette année, les récoltes ont été maigres. Il faut que les ONG nous appuient.
Les avis des réfugiés rencontrés divergent quant à leur implication dans les activités des humanitaires. Ils plaident tous pour un meilleur système éducatif, une amélioration des qualités et des soins. Un reportage de Majingo Menguinabe au camp de réfugiés de Djabal à l'est du Tchad.
I think that program raises some really interesting questions, both from the positive and the things that were said, and also from the criticisms of the humanitarian system. Thank you very much for bringing this here to the meeting. Before we talk about some of the issues that the program raised, though, Abdeassoul, I'd like to ask more generally, given that you have great experience in this, about your experience of the use of communications media, and particularly radio, in humanitarian crisis. How have you found that radio can help in crisis?
Oui, en fait, le média joue un rôle très important dans...
The importance of the radio is in times of crisis. For example, in our situation, it's a Sudanese crisis. It's just like, imagine yourself, you're stuck in an airport due to weather problem. It's like you're not sure, you don't know when you're going to leave, you don't have a concrete information. So we provide this kind of information, so the refugees wouldn't be stressed. And this is done using the local language. Instead of doing it in French or in Arab, they're going to be more reliable when the information is provided within their own language.
Abdeassoul, first I want to thank you for bringing those voices to enrich our discussions here. And I also want to congratulate you on a long time running radio program with 200,000 listeners in refugee camps and 300,000 in Chad. I think that speaks volumes for the importance of your radio show. If I may ask one question, and I want to pick up on the differences that Paul pointed out. We've heard a group of people saying positive things about their involvement and their participation in the programs that NGOs are running. And we've also heard a group of people saying it needs to be better, we're not involved. I heard someone specifically saying NGOs are imposing their laws on us. And those are stark differences. And I wonder if that comes from the amount of, or the length of time that people have stayed in the refugee camps. In other words, do you find from your experience of talking with refugees, the longer they stay in the camp, are they more involved, more participating, more active in programs delivered in the camps? Or is it the other way around? Is it people who just arrived, who've lived in the camps only for a short period of time, who are more engaged than those who lived for a long period of time? I wonder if you've seen a difference or a correlation between the amount of time lived or stayed in the camps and with the engagement of refugees in the programs. I wonder if you've seen any difference in that.
Par rapport à cette question, moi je dirais que...
As you have seen in this video, there are different ideas, and it's not only necessarily the new refugees who participate, but it's just a thing in any kind of society. So, for example, in our case, in the camp of Jabar, the last ones who arrived, it's been 5 years. And right now they completely understand their environment, and their participation, mostly what we have seen, is depending on the sector. For example, on the distribution sector, they are very implicated, but whereas on the education sector, they're not very much implicated. So we cannot have a clear solution. We cannot solve this immediately. So we need, what we have to do is we need to bring change for our kids. And many more humanitarian agencies must be implicated to this objective. And yesterday we have talked about standards and also a budget. So it's a lot of different objectives which we must consider in order to have a long-term change.
Je vais rajouter que, bien sûr, avec plus de...
So the refugees, when they spend a lot of time in the camps, they will be more implicated because at the beginning they will face a lot of challenges. So the more time they spend, the more they'll be implicated.
Great, thank you, Abdeassoul. Misikir, I'd like to turn to you, actually, to continue that idea. We talked about differences within a single population in the camp. Africa Humanitarian Action works in, I think, 10 countries in Africa. And I wondered if through that work you'd seen that there were differences in the nature and degree of engagement from one sort of country context to another.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I mean, I think what we saw in this video is probably representative of what we see in camps, at least in the countries where we work. Yesterday in the opening session, there was this discussion about, or one of the panelists has mentioned about context. And context definitely matters, I think, when we talk about engagement and participation. I think Abdeassoul now mentioned the sector within the sector of aid also matters. I think people naturally, whether they're refugees or us living in the normal environment, we tend to be engaged more on the things that matter the most, the basic necessities for us, shelter, food, water. I mean, whether you're a refugee or not, those are basic necessities. And we see that in those specific sectors, the engagement of the community is very high. We heard someone in the video saying, we want better education and better health care for our children. I mean, I don't think that's only applicable in refugee camps. I think that's also applicable in our daily lives. I mean, here we vote politicians in and out of office if based on the quality of education and healthcare they provide for our communities. So what we see across the countries we work is the basic human needs are universal, whether they're for Sudanese refugees in Chad or for Congolese refugees in Uganda. I think those needs are the same, and the engagement of our communities are higher to maintain the quality of service they receive for these basic needs. I would even say basic human rights that they have to get quality education, water, food, healthcare. So I think it's universal. What we heard is representative in what we see in most of the countries where we work.
Great, thanks. It's interesting you mentioned politicians, actually, because I was wondering, again, with these very different contexts that Africa Humanitarian Action is working in, presumably you're working in very different social structures and power structures from one place to another. Do you have any way of sort of taking that into account or thinking about how that will enable or people to become engaged with you or make it more hard for them?
Yes, I think before we go into any situation, any emergency or protracted refugee situation, we take time to analyze, number one, the existing social structures for the communities that we serve. Where do they come from? What is the sort of engagement within themselves that they're used to? And we try to be conscious not to come and impose a new way of living, a new way of existing just because they are now forced into this displaced situation out of their countries. They've crossed borders. I mean, we can take, for example, going back to, say, 2010, 2011, Somali refugees who are displaced due to the drought and conflict and arriving into Ethiopia. And we were going in the camps to provide shelter. And we had to consider the normal ways of living from the communities where they left, from the environment where they left. And of course, in our dealings with our international supporters and partners, we had to present that. I mean, we can't just bring a shelter that worked in another part of the country here in Ethiopia and impose it on this set of community that came from a totally different part of the continent. So we do take that into our analysis, into our programming. Sometimes, of course, realities dictate. If it's an emergency and you have to provide food and water and shelter immediately, you have to do that, and you have to make do with what you have at hand. But the more protracted the situations become, and the more livable and comfortable that you can make it with the amount of resources that you have, then you have to do that. So we do take that into context.
Thanks, and it's really interesting that you mentioned there the idea of not imposing things, because sometimes I would imagine the idea of engagement for certain sectors of the population, the handing over of power to a degree, is in itself an imposition. Not necessarily a bad imposition, but it's a new thing. And I think one thing that the radio program brought up really interestingly is that if I understand correctly, some of the systems that have been set up for engagement in the refugee camp have in fact empowered and given voice to women in a way that they would not necessarily have had in their villages of origin. And I wondered if we could explore this idea a little bit more, Binapani. You work in a women's organisation and you work very closely with women. I know in a recent cyclone, your organisation was engaged in supporting the community, but working particularly with women to do that. Could you tell us a little bit about the specific difficulties that the women in that community had as women in the situation of the cyclone? And also, could you tell us a little bit about how your organisation was able to engage with and work with those women to help them overcome those difficulties?
Myself, Binapani Mishra. I am representing implementing organization that is SWAD in Odisha, India. In near past, there the severe Phylline cyclone has been flown over the Odisha coast, and in that, not only the cyclone but also it is followed by the big flood in some of the area where we are working. Both the cyclone and the flood and heavy rain. Due to these situations, people having in their village also very vulnerable to that. And the water was entered, the thatched house is gone up and the water is going inside the room. Also the water is flowing in the roadside of the villages. So the people's the women and the children are most vulnerable at that situations.